The St. Lawrence River, November 11th, 1813. Dawn breaks cold and gray over water that moves like liquid lead, carrying with it the largest American army of the entire war. 7,000 souls packed into hundreds of civilian bateaux, rafts, and commandeered boats. A floating city of blue-coated regulars, militia, and artillery, all drifting inexorably toward a single target: Montreal. This is the St. Lawrence Campaign, the grand American gamble of 1813, a two-pronged offensive designed to deliver the decisive, war-winning blow. Private Thomas Wheeler huddled in the bottom of his bateau with 30 other soldiers, fingers numb around his Springfield musket. The cold seeped through his wool uniform like water through cloth. Around him stretched an armada that seemed to fill the river horizon to horizon. Boats and more boats, oars creaking in rhythm, men coughing and spitting into the November air. 24 years old, a Vermont farmer who'd taken the enlistment bounty 8 months ago, Wheeler had never seen so many soldiers in one place. The sight should have filled him with confidence. Instead, his lips moved in silent prayer. "Lord, let me see Vermont again." The prayer felt necessary because for 3 weeks this armada had been dying by degrees. Not from battle, from something worse. Harassment. A shadow force of British and Canadians, never more than a few hundred strong, had dogged their every mile down the St. Lawrence. Supply dumps burned in the night. Stragglers vanished. Sentries found with their throats cut. The Americans outnumbered this phantom enemy 20-1, perhaps more, yet could never bring them to battle. The shadow would materialize long enough to kill, then dissolve back into the Canadian wilderness like smoke. Wheeler looked at the faces around him in the boat. Some men slept despite the cold, exhausted from weeks of this grinding advance. Others stared at nothing, eyes hollow. Lieutenant Marcus Holloway sat in the stern, West Point class of 1809, checking his pistols for the third time that morning. 27 years old and already showing gray at his temples. The strain showed on every officer's face, the weight of leading men who were losing faith. The boat rocked as a wave from another vessel washed over them. Cold spray hit Wheeler's face and he tasted the river, metallic and bitter. He didn't know that in 8 hours he would be running through mud with British bayonets at his back, leaving everything behind: his musket, his pride, and 17 of his messmates. He didn't know that this November day would change the fate of a continent, that the shadow force would finally turn and make it stand, that numerical superiority would prove meaningless against something as simple and terrible as discipline. All he knew was the cold, the fear, and the whispered hope that this would end soon. Officers said the British shadow numbered only 900 men, 900 against 7,000. The mathematics seemed obvious. One more fight, they said. Clear away this nuisance, then Montreal would fall and the war would be over. Wheeler closed his eyes and tried to believe it. On the northern bank of the St. Lawrence, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Wanton Morrison stood with a telescope pressed to his eye, methodically counting boats. 34 years old. Lean and weathered, he moved with the economy of a man who wasted nothing. Not words, not motion, not opportunities. The cold wind that made the Americans miserable barely registered on him. He had spent too many winters on campaign to notice such things anymore. 43, 44, 45 boats in that section alone, he murmured, lowering the glass. Captain Plenderleith, his aide, stood nearby, young and eager and clearly uncertain about what would happen next. The view through Morrison's telescope told a story. 7,000 men, perhaps more. Artillery, cavalry. The entire American war effort concentrated into one massive thrust toward the heart of British North America. If Montreal fell, everything north and west of it would wither on the vine. Upper Canada, modern Ontario, would be cut off from supplies, reinforcements, ammunition. The British garrisons scattered across that vast territory would starve or surrender. The war would be over and Canada would cease to exist as anything separate from the American Republic. Morrison had been tasked with preventing this through harassment. For 3 weeks, his corps of observation, 900 British regulars, Canadian militia, and Mohawk warriors, had stung and bled this American giant. Supply raids, ambushes, psychological warfare. Never a stand-up fight because the numbers made that suicidal. His orders were clear: delay, disrupt, demoralize. Do not engage directly. He was about to disobey those orders. "Sir," Plenderleath ventured, "they're pulling to shore. Landing in force." Morrison studied the shoreline where American boats were beaching, disgorging hundreds of soldiers onto the muddy banks. He could see officers organizing them into formations, see the glint of bayonets being fixed, see the purposeful activity of an army preparing for battle. They were coming for him. Finally, after weeks of his harassment, they had decided to turn and crush the gnat that had been biting their heels. "Are they indeed?" Morrison allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Orders, sir? Fall back?" Morrison lowered the telescope and turned to look at the land behind him. Chrysler's farm stretched out in a series of plowed fields, flat and open, still muddy from recent rain. To the right, the St. Lawrence flowed broad and impassable. To the left, dense woods cut by a steep ravine, and in the center, that beautiful open ground. Innocent-looking farmland that would become something else entirely in a few hours. "No, Captain. We've been running for weeks. Time to stop running." Plenderleath's face registered shock. "Sir, they outnumber us. 8-1, yes." Morrison's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "But they have to come to us, across that." He gestured to the open field. "It's not a farm, Captain. It's a parade ground, and parade grounds are where we're unbeatable." The young aide looked at the field and saw only mud. Morrison looked at the same field and saw a European battlefield transported to the Canadian wilderness. He had fought in Spain against Napoleon's forces. He had seen French columns, deep and powerful, crash against British lines and shatter. The French fought the same way these Americans did, mass formations designed for shock and momentum. The British had developed a counter, the thin red line. 2 ranks deep, every man able to shoot, maximum firepower concentrated into devastating volleys that could stop any column dead. The Americans would use columns. They always did. They had copied French tactics from observation of the Napoleonic Wars, mistaking the tactic for the system. Columns worked when supported by overwhelming artillery, when backed by veteran cavalry, when the enemy line was already wavering. Columns did not work against steady British professionals who had drilled until loading and firing a musket was as natural as breathing. Morrison had chosen this ground 2 days ago. He had walked every inch of it, noted every advantage. Right flank secured by the river, where the enemy could not outflank him. Left flank protected by woods and ravine, where his Canadian voltigeurs and Mohawk allies could fight the kind of irregular warfare they excelled at. Center completely open, perfect for his line formations, perfect for the kind of killing ground that made European battlefields so terrible and so decisive. "Send word to the regiment commanders," Morrison said quietly. "We fight tomorrow. Here." Plenderleath hesitated, then saluted and hurried off. Morrison turned back to the river, watching the American boats continue to land. He felt no fear, only a kind of cold clarity. 900 men against 7,000. The mathematics horrified everyone who heard them, but mathematics only mattered if both sides fought the same way. He was about to teach the Americans that discipline mattered more than numbers, that ground mattered more than courage, that leadership decided battles more surely than any advantage of force. He looked at the gray field one more time. Tomorrow it would be different. Tomorrow it would be red. The strategic situation that brought these armies to this obscure Canadian farm began with a dream and a miscalculation. The United States, 37 years old in 1813, was a nation with imperial ambitions and insufficient means. The War of 1812 had been declared ostensibly over maritime rights, British impressment of American sailors, restrictions on American trade during the Napoleonic Wars. But in the war councils of Washington, another goal gleamed like forbidden fruit: Canada. Thomas Jefferson had called it a mere matter of marching. Henry Clay spoke of conquering Canada in a single campaign. The logic seemed irresistible. Britain was fighting for its life against Napoleon in Europe. Most of its veteran troops were committed there. Canada was lightly defended, thinly populated, surely ripe for the taking. A swift invasion, the story went, and the Canadians would welcome their American liberators, joining the Republic willingly. Reality had proven crueler than rhetoric. The invasions of 1812 had failed spectacularly. General William Hull surrendered Detroit without firing a shot, a humiliation that resulted in his court-martial. At Queenston Heights, American forces briefly took the high ground only to be driven off with heavy losses. The Canadians, far from welcoming their would-be liberators, fought with a ferocity that surprised everyone. French Canadians and English Canadians, traditional rivals, found common cause in resisting invasion. The Mohawk and other First Nations saw American expansion as an existential threat and allied with the British. By 1813, the American strategy had evolved through necessity. Forget trying to conquer all of Canada at once. Instead, strike at the jugular. Montreal. The city sat astride the St. Lawrence River, the vital artery that fed the entire British position in North America. Every musket ball, every pound of gunpowder, every reinforcement heading to Upper Canada passed through Montreal. Take the city and everything west of it would wither. The plan was elegant. Two armies would converge on Montreal from different directions, a classic pincer movement. General Wade Hampton would advance north from Lake Champlain with 4,000 men, the southern pincer. Major General James Wilkinson would bring 7,000 troops down the St. Lawrence River from Lake Ontario, the northern pincer. They would join forces before Montreal and overwhelm the city's meager defenses with 11,000 men. The British commander, Sir George Prevost, had perhaps 15,000 troops total spread across the entire expanse of Canada. He could not concentrate enough force to defend everywhere. Montreal would fall. The mathematics made sense on paper. In practice, the execution depended on two generals, and here the American plan began to crack. Wade Hampton was competent enough, a veteran of the Revolution, but he distrusted Wilkinson personally and would prove reluctant to coordinate closely. But Hampton's failings paled beside those of the Northern Pincer's commander. Major General James Wilkinson represented everything wrong with political generalship in the early American Republic. 56 years old, he commanded the largest American army in the field, not through merit, but through seniority, connections, and survival of countless scandals. On Wilkinson's command boat, the general lay in a cushioned chair, pale and sweating despite the November cold. Dysentery had ravaged him for weeks. He should have relinquished command to a healthy subordinate. Pride and fear prevented that. Pride because he had spent a lifetime accumulating rank and would not surrender it. Fear because he knew what awaited him after this campaign. Another court-martial, another investigation, another scandal. What none of his officers knew, what even Wilkinson had tried to forget, was the deepest scandal of all. For 26 years, he had been Agent 13, a paid informant of the Spanish Crown. $2,000 a year to pass along intelligence about American frontier activities, military dispositions, political intrigues. The payments had stopped years ago when Spanish power in North America waned, but the betrayal remained. If discovered, it would mean execution for treason. Even now, sick and desperate, part of Wilkinson's fevered mind worried that this campaign was his last chance to rehabilitate his reputation, to die or triumph in a way that would make people forget all the whispered accusations. He stared at the map spread before him, trying to concentrate through the intestinal pain. The campaign was behind schedule. The American army had been delayed by logistics, by weather, by that damned British shadow force. Hampton's southern pincer should have reached Montreal already. No word had come, which meant delays on that front too, but Wilkinson assumed it was just the usual friction of war. Get to Montreal, combine forces, overwhelm the defenders. Simple. The simplicity was an illusion. Wilkinson had no idea that Hampton had already failed, that the southern pincer had been broken, that the entire strategic foundation of the campaign had already collapsed. The news had not reached him yet. When it did, it would arrive at the worst possible moment. A knock on the cabin door. Wilkinson straightened, tried to look commanding. "Enter." Brigadier General John Parker Boyd stepped in, bringing cold air with him. 40 years old, competent, experienced, and increasingly frustrated with serving under Wilkinson. Boyd had been doing the actual work of commanding the army on the ground, while Wilkinson issued vague directives from his sickbed. The gap between them went beyond illness. Boyd was a professional soldier. Wilkinson was a political creature. Boyd understood tactics. Wilkinson understood survival. Sir, Boyd's voice was carefully neutral. Scouts report the British forces camped at Chrysler's farm, approximately 900 strong. They've been shadowing us for 3 weeks. The men are nervous. Wilkinson waved a dismissive hand. 900. We have 7,000 regulars. The mathematics are obvious, General. They're professionals, sir. British regulars, not militia. They've been effective. They've been a nuisance. Wilkinson's voice sharpened. Nothing more. A gnat stinging a lion. The men are nervous because we've allowed this gnat to persist. Time to swat it. Boyd studied the map. Part of him agreed. 900 against 7,000 should be trivial. But instinct, born of long experience, whispered warnings. Morrison was no fool. British regulars were among the best-trained soldiers in the world. Those thin red lines had broken French columns in Spain time and again. Still, numbers were numbers. And the army's morale desperately needed a victory, something to restore confidence after weeks of cold, wet misery being harassed by an enemy they could not catch. Your orders, sir? Wilkinson leaned forward, trying to project authority despite his weakened state. Land sufficient force. Say 2,500 regulars. Find this British corpse, fix it, destroy it. I want this annoyance dispersed by nightfall tomorrow. Dispersed, sir? Scattered, broken, sent running. Wilkinson's hand sketched a dismissive gesture. They're 900 men, General. You have 2,500 regulars, artillery, cavalry. It should be trivial. Boyd held his tongue. Trivial. The word revealed how little Wilkinson understood, but orders were orders. Understood, sir. I'll organize the landing for tomorrow morning. As Boyd turned to leave, Wilkinson's voice stopped him. Oh, and General, this needs to be quick. I've received discouraging news from the South. Boyd turned back. Sir? General Hampton, difficulties. We may not have the support we anticipated. What kind of difficulties? Wilkinson waved his hand again. That dismissive gesture that seemed to be his answer to everything. Handle your battle. General, I'll handle the strategy. Boyd left the cabin feeling more uneasy than before. Difficulties with Hampton, vague, ominous, and typically Wilkinson, sharing just enough information to worry subordinates while withholding the details that might allow them to adjust plans. As Boyd walked the deck back toward his own quarters, he tried to calculate. If Hampton was delayed, could Wilkinson's 7,000 take Montreal alone? Possibly if the city's defenses were as weak as reported, but if Hampton had met serious resistance, he pushed the thought away. Focus on the immediate problem. Tomorrow they would land 2,500 regulars and destroy Morrison's force. Textbook attack. Secure the flanks, advance in columns, use superior numbers to overwhelm the center. The British line would break, the survivors would flee, and the way to Montreal would be clear, simple, clean, obvious. Boyd had learned over the years to distrust anything that seemed obvious. Night fell over both camps like a curtain. On the American boats, men tried to find warmth in blankets that were never quite dry. Wheeler huddled with his messmates, listening to them speculate about tomorrow's fight. Some were confident, almost eager, finally a chance to come to grips with the shadow that had tormented them for weeks. Others were quiet, writing letters home by candlelight. The kind of letters soldiers write when they are not certain they will survive to post them. Wheeler started a letter to his mother. Dear Mother, tomorrow we fight a small British force. Officers say it'll be over quick. I'll post this from Montreal. Your son, Thomas. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket. The words felt hollow even as he wrote them. Over quick. Maybe. Or maybe the British would fight like they had in Spain, where Wellington's thin red lines had stopped Napoleon's best marshals cold. Lieutenant Holloway sat apart from the enlisted men, as protocol demanded, but close enough to feel their presence. He had drawn his pistols and was checking them again, though they had been checked a dozen times already. The ritual was comforting. Load, prime, half cock, check the flint, check the powder in the pan. His sword lay across his knees, freshly sharpened. 27 years old, and he had seen enough combat to know that tomorrow would not be easy, regardless of what Wilkinson said. The West Point education had taught him tactics and engineering, but not this, the waiting. The doubt, the weight of knowing that men would follow his orders into musket fire and some would not come back. He thought about the British force at Chrysler's farm. 900 men against 2,500. The ratio should guarantee victory, but ratios did not account for training, for leadership, for the thousand intangibles that turn battles. On the British side, the mood was different. Morrison's camp was smaller, more compact, and the men moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals who knew their business. Fires were kept small to avoid giving away exact positions. Sentries rotated with mechanical precision. Soldiers cleaned their muskets with religious care, checking flints, sorting cartridges, ensuring that every piece of equipment would function when needed. Sergeant William McCarthy, 32 years old, a veteran of the Peninsular War and a pillar of the 49th Regiment's Green Tigers, walked among the younger soldiers offering advice in a voice roughened by years of shouting orders over battlefield din. "Remember what I've taught you," he told a knot of privates, some barely 18. "Hold your fire. I know the Americans will be shooting at you. I know you'll want to shoot back. Don't. Wait for the command. Stand steady. You do that, we win. Simple as that." One of the young privates, James Connor, 19 years old and trying not to show his fear, spoke up. "Sergeant, they've got thousands. We're 900. McCarthy's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Aye, lad, they do. But they'll be coming at us in columns, packed tight as fish in a barrel. We'll be in line. Every man can shoot. They come at us. We give them a proper British welcome. 3 volleys so fast they won't know what hit them, then the bayonet. Done it in Spain against the French. Works every time if you hold steady." "What if we don't hold?" The smile vanished. "Then we die, and Canada dies with us. So we hold." McCarthy moved on, leaving the young soldiers to contemplate that. In the woods on the left flank, the Canadian voltigeurs made their own preparations. These were not British regulars, but professional Canadian light infantry, most of them French-speaking, fighting to defend their homes from invasion. Jean-Baptiste Dubois, 22, farmer's son from near Montreal, checked his rifle with the care of a man who had grown up hunting. His weapon was more accurate than the British muskets, designed for marksmen rather than massed volleys. Tomorrow he would use it to kill men he had never met, men who spoke his language differently, but whose country he would defend to his last breath. The Mohawk warriors camped separately, as was their custom. War Chief Karanhiakaha, the name meant sky, conferred with his 30 warriors in their own language. 35 years old, he had fought in multiple conflicts and understood better than most that this alliance with the British was pragmatic, not sentimental. The Americans represented expansion, settlement, the destruction of traditional hunting grounds. The British, for all their faults, at least offered a framework where the Mohawk could maintain some autonomy. Tomorrow they would fight not for the British king, but for their own survival. Morrison himself walked the perimeter of his camp, alone except for his thoughts. He had gambled everything on this stand. His orders had been to harass, not engage. By choosing to fight here, he was risking annihilation. If the Americans broke his line, if his 900 regulars fled, the road to Montreal would lie open and his career would end in disgrace or death. But he had seen the ground. He had studied his enemy, and he had absolute faith in his soldiers. The 49th Regiment had earned their nickname, Green Tigers, through ferocity and discipline. The 89th Regiment, Blaney's Bloodhounds, were equally professional. Add the Canadian Fencibles, the elite voltigeurs, the Mohawk Warriors, and the Royal Artillery with their 2 6-pounders, and Morrison had not 900 men, but 900 highly trained specialists, each knowing their role, each drilled to perfection. The Americans would come with numbers. Morrison would answer with discipline. The Americans would come with courage. Morrison would answer with tactics. The Americans would come expecting victory. Morrison would teach them the difference between expecting and earning. He stopped at the edge of the field that would become tomorrow's battlefield. In the darkness, it looked peaceful, just plowed farmland waiting for spring. By this time tomorrow, it would be something else. He allowed himself to imagine it. The smoke, the noise, the carefully orchestrated violence of professional soldiers doing what they were trained to do. The Americans would advance in their columns, magnificent and doomed. The British would wait, silent and steady. And when the range closed to that critical distance, When Morrison gave the order, 600 muskets would speak as one. The first snow of winter began to fall, light flurries that melted on contact with the ground. Morrison turned back toward his tent, his mind already moving through tomorrow's battle step by step, anticipating, planning, preparing. He was not a man given to dramatics or grand gestures. He would not make speeches or invoke glory. His soldiers knew their duty. Tomorrow they would perform it, and either Canada would survive or it would not. On both sides of the field, men tried to sleep. Some succeeded. Others lay awake staring at canvas or sky, thinking of home, of loved ones, of what tomorrow might bring. The river flowed past, indifferent to human plans. The snow fell harder, and in the hours before dawn, the kind of silence that precedes violence settled over Crysler's farm. Wheeler finally dozed off around midnight, his last conscious thought a fragment of that prayer. Lord, let me see Vermont again. He did not dream, or if he did not remember. When the drums woke him at 5 in the morning, it took a moment to remember where he was, what was happening. Then it all came back. The battle, the British, the certainty that before this day ended, everything would change. Men stirred in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the stiff awkwardness of soldiers who had slept in their uniforms. No fires were allowed. They were too close to the enemy now. Breakfast was hardtack and cold water, eaten standing up, weapons close at hand. Officers moved among the ranks, checking equipment, offering quiet words of encouragement or sharp rebukes for slovenly kit. Boyd had organized his force into 3 main elements. The center would be 2,000 regulars formed into attack columns, deep, narrow formations designed to punch through enemy lines by sheer weight and momentum. The tactic was borrowed from French practice, proven effective in European wars. On the right, 500 light infantry would advance through the woods, clearing British skirmishers and securing that flank. In reserve, Captain Richard Smythe's cavalry, 150 dragoons with their sabers and plumed helmets, ready to exploit any breakthrough or run down fleeing enemies. The artillery crews prepared their 4 6-pounder cannons, checking the wheels, sorting round shot and canister, ensuring everything was ready. 4 cannons to the British 2. Another advantage, as dawn broke properly, gray and cold, the American force formed up on the shore. 2,500 men in blue coats, white cross belts gleaming, flags unfurled and snapping in the November wind. It was an impressive sight, enough to make even nervous soldiers feel a surge of confidence. How could 900 men stand against this? Across the field, Morrison watched them come. His telescope picked out details: the regimental flags, the artillery being brought forward, the cavalry massing in reserve. Professional work, competently executed. Boyd was no fool. The attack would be well coordinated, textbook perfect, which meant it would be predictable. Morrison turned to his assembled officers: Major Clifford of the 49th, Major Plenderleith, Captain Barnes of the artillery, and the commanders of the Canadian contingents. All veterans, all steady. He did not need to make speeches. These men knew their business. Gentlemen, they're coming. Perhaps 3,000 in the main attack, another 500 in the woods. We deploy as planned. Clifford, your 49th holds the center with the 89th. 2-rank line, full frontage. Barnes, your guns in the center, maximum field of fire. Voltigeurs and the Mohawks in the woods. You know what to do. Fencibles in reserve. Questions? There were none. The plan was simple, which made it strong. Let the enemy come to them. Let superior numbers mean nothing in the constricted killing ground Morrison had chosen. Hold the line. Fire on command. When the moment came, advance with the bayonet. Then to your posts, and gentlemen, Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. Today we stand. That's all. Stand when they advance. Stand when they fire. Stand when everything tells you to run. You do that, we win. Dismissed. The officers dispersed. Morrison remained a moment longer, looking at the field with the eye of a man who had turned geography into weapon. Right flank, secured by river. Left flank, woods and ravine where regular infantry would be useless but light troops would excel. Center, 600 yards of open ground where British volley fire would dominate. It was perfect. The Americans began their advance at 8 in the morning. The light infantry detached first, 500 men moving toward the woods in loose order, ready to fight the kind of irregular skirmish warfare that their training had prepared them for. Lieutenant Holloway was among them, pistols loaded, sword drawn, leading his platoon into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made experienced soldiers nervous. They advanced carefully, checking behind trees, scanning ahead for any sign of the enemy. The undergrowth was thick, the ground uneven, cut by that ravine Morrison had spotted. Visibility dropped to 30 yards, then 20. Impossible to maintain proper formation in this terrain. The first shot cracked like a whip, and an American officer spun and fell. Then the woods exploded. 60 voltigeurs and 30 Mohawk warriors opened fire simultaneously from concealment, and the American light infantry walked into a storm of lead. Men dropped, screaming. Others dove for cover. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the confusion. Dubois lay behind his fallen log, rifle still smoking from his first shot. He had aimed for the officer, seen him fall, and was already reloading with the speed of long practice. Around him, his fellow voltigeurs fired and moved, never staying in one place, making themselves impossible targets. The Americans tried to return fire, but their muskets were designed for massed volleys, not individual accuracy. They could barely see their targets. The Mohawks fought differently, using the terrain with intimate knowledge, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Some had muskets, others traditional weapons. All were terrifyingly effective in this environment. The Americans pushed forward, trying to clear the woods through sheer weight of numbers, but every advance cost them casualties. Then they found the ravine, 15 feet deep, 30 feet wide, cut through the woods like a scar. The far side bristled with voltigeur, using the high ground to shoot down at anyone trying to cross. The first American attempt to rush it ended in slaughter. Men trapped in the bottom of the ravine, struggling in mud, cut down by marksmen firing from above. Holloway, crouched behind a tree, realized with sick certainty that this flank would not be cleared quickly. Maybe not at all. They were supposed to secure the woods in 30 minutes, then support the main attack. Instead, they were locked in a vicious stalemate that was bleeding them white. In the center, Boyd watched the woods fight develop with growing frustration. His plan required both flanks secure before the main attack proceeded, but the left was stalled. He could hear the firing, see smoke rising from the trees, but no word came that the woods were clear. Time was slipping away. The morning was advancing. Every minute of delay cost him surprise, cost him momentum. And Wilkinson, watching from his boat downriver, would be wondering why the attack had not begun. Boyd made the decision. The main attack would proceed with the left flank still contested. Risky, but the alternative was to wait indefinitely. He had overwhelming numerical superiority in the center. Even with one flank in the air, he could smash through Morrison's thin line with his columns. The drums began to beat. 2,500 men formed into their attack columns, deep, narrow, powerful. 8 regiments worth of regulars, the best troops America could field, organized into human battering rams. They would advance across 600 yards of open ground, absorb whatever fire the British could deliver, and crash into that impossibly thin line. The British would break. They had to break. No line 2 men deep could stand against this weight of numbers and momentum. Wheeler found himself in the middle ranks of one column, surrounded by the men of the 11th Infantry. He could not see the British line ahead, could only see the backs of the men in front of him, their blue coats and white cross belts, their muskets held at shoulder arms. The column was perhaps 30 men deep and 40 wide, a giant rectangle of flesh and steel. The ground shook with the tramp of feet. Drums beat the advance. Somewhere ahead, British guns opened fire. The sound reached them first, a deep boom that echoed off the river. Then a scream in the sky, getting louder. Wheeler looked up instinctively and saw nothing. Then the round shot hit. It struck the front of the column, and men simply vanished. The iron ball, weighing 6 pounds and moving at 1,000 feet per second, tore through flesh and bone with contemptuous ease. It skipped after the first impact and took out 2 more men before burying itself in the mud. The column closed ranks over the dead and kept advancing. This was what they were trained to do: absorb casualties, keep moving, present an unstoppable front. The British artillery fired again, both guns this time, and more holes appeared in the American formation. Wheeler tasted bile but kept his feet moving. Don't think, don't look, just march. 300 yards out, the British switched to canister. The iron balls were replaced with tin cans filled with dozens of musket balls. When fired, the cannons became giant shotguns, spraying metal in wide destructive cones. The effect on the packed columns was catastrophic. Each shot took down 5, 10, 15 men. The front ranks began to look ragged. Men were falling faster than gaps could close. But still they came. American officers on horseback rode beside the columns, shouting encouragement, waving swords. The mathematics were still in their favor. Lose 100 men, 200, even 300, they could afford it. The British only had 900 total. Once the columns closed with the line, once the bayonet work began, superior numbers would tell. 200 yards, 150. Morrison's line became visible through the smoke of the cannons, a thin red stripe across the field, absolutely motionless. Wheeler could make out individual soldiers now, see their faces, see the muskets held at rest. Why weren't they firing? At this range, muskets were effective, unless they were waiting, unless Morrison had drilled his men to hold fire, to let the Americans close to optimal range, to deliver not scattered shots, but a single massive volley. The French columns in Spain had learned this lesson the hard way, over and over. Wheeler did not know about Spain. He was about to learn anyway. 100 yards. Some men in the front ranks of the columns raised their muskets and fired without orders, nervous energy finding release. A ragged volley rippled along the American front. Most shots went high. Smoke obscured vision. The columns kept advancing, now at a slow run, officers screaming encouragement, men screaming back in fear or rage or both. 80 yards. Morrison raised his sword. 600 British regulars, standing in two ranks, brought their muskets to the ready position as one. The movement was so precise it looked choreographed. Front rank kneeling, rear rank standing, every barrel aimed at the mass of blue coats struggling across the muddy field toward them. 70 yards. On the British line, Sergeant McCarthy gripped his musket and watched the American columns approach. He had seen this before, at Badajoz, at Salamanca. The French came in columns, the British stood in line, and always the line won if it held steady. The young Private Connor knelt beside him in the front rank, musket braced against the ground, barrel pointed at the approaching enemy. The boy was shaking, but he was in position, ready. 65 yards. Morrison's voice cut through the din, trained to be heard over battlefield noise. 49th and 89th, make ready. 600 hammers cocked. The mechanical sound, 600 metal clicks happening almost simultaneously, was audible even over the drums and shouting. Present! 600 muskets leveled. Every barrel aimed at the dense mass of Americans, now less than 70 yards away. Wheeler, in the middle of the column, could not see the British line, but he could feel the sudden wrongness in the air, the sense that something terrible was about to happen. The world held its breath. Morrison's sword was still raised. The American columns, sensing the critical moment, began to raise their own muskets, officers shouting, "Fire! Fire!" But the command was lost in confusion. Men in the middle and rear ranks could not shoot without hitting their own front ranks. The columns were too deep, too packed. Morrison's sword fell. Fire! The sound was not individual shots. It was a single massive detonation, a physical force that punched the air. 600 Brown Bess muskets discharged as one. A wall of flame and smoke erupting along the entire length of the British line. The smoke cloud was so thick it obscured everything. But the sound that came after the initial blast told the story. Screaming, not the battle cries of attacking soldiers, but the animal shrieks of men, suddenly, catastrophically hurt. Wheeler felt the shock wave of air, felt blood hit his face though he was in the middle ranks. Men in front of him simply ceased to exist, turned into torn meat by the lead balls. The front four ranks of the column were annihilated in that single second. 100 men dead or dying from one volley. The mathematical advantage was suddenly meaningless. The column's momentum stopped dead. Through the smoke, the British were already reloading. 15 seconds, muscle memory drilled into them over years. Tear cartridge, pour powder, ram ball, prime pan, cock, present. Wheeler stood frozen. Around him, men were screaming, some wounded, some terrified. Officers were shouting, "Forward! Forward!" But no one moved forward. How could they? The front of the column was gone. The second volley crashed out. Another wall of lead. Another 100 Americans hit. The column began to disintegrate. Men in the rear ranks, who could not see what was happening ahead but could hear it, began to edge backward. The formation that was supposed to be an irresistible battering ram had become a stationary target, absorbing punishment it could not answer. Third volley, fourth. The British reloaded and fired with mechanical precision, 3 rounds per minute. Sustained volleys that simply chewed the American formation apart. Something punched Wheeler's thigh, a sharp heat he barely registered through the terror. His musket fell from nerveless fingers. Around him, men were running, throwing down equipment, fleeing back toward the boats. The column attack had failed. Worse than failed, it had been slaughtered. Boyd, watching from his command post, felt his stomach drop. His main attack, 2,500 regulars, was breaking. Not defeated through hard fighting, but shattered by superior firepower, delivered with inhuman precision. He had one card left, one arm still uncommitted: the cavalry. Captain Richard Smith received the order with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because cavalry was supposed to charge broken infantry, and the American infantry was certainly broken. Dread because the British infantry was not. That red line was still standing, still firing, still absolutely steady. Charging steady infantry in line was suicide, but orders were orders. 2nd Dragoons, column of 4s, draw sabers. 150 cavalrymen formed up, sabers sliding from scabbards with a collective ring of steel. Smith raised his own saber, looked at his troopers, good men, professionals, brave, and tried not to think about what he was about to ask of them. "Advance!" The dragoons moved from walk to trot, hooves churning mud that had already been churned by thousands of infantry boots. Smith could see the British line through gaps in the smoke, still intact, still firing into the broken American columns. His training told him this was wrong. Cavalry should charge routing enemies, not steady formations. But desperation had its own logic. Break that line, and the battle was won. Fail to break it, and he refused to complete the thought. The horses sensed their riders' tension and responded with nervous energy, ears flattened, nostrils flaring. Smith pressed his heels and the trot became a canter. The ground shook with rhythmic thunder. Behind him, 150 men in plumed helmets with sabers raised, a river of horseflesh and steel flowing toward the red line. Morrison saw them coming and felt something close to satisfaction. The Americans were following the script exactly as he had anticipated. Infantry columns shattered by volleys, cavalry committed in desperation. Everything unfolding with the predictability of men who knew only one way to fight. He called to Major Clifford. "Cavalry front, stand fast." The 49th Regiment shifted muskets fractionally, barrels angling lower. Horses, not riders. Target the mounts, and the charge collapsed into chaos. This was drilled into British infantry from their first day. Cavalry was terrifying but beatable if you held your nerve and aimed true. Private Connor, in the front rank, watched the dragoons approach and felt his bowels turn to water. The horses were enormous, getting bigger with each second, foam flying from their mouths, hooves like hammers. His hands shook on the musket. Sergeant McCarthy's voice cut through the fear. "Steady, lad. They're just men on horses. Wait for the word." 300 yards. The canter became a gallop. Smith raised his saber higher, angling his horse toward the center of the British line. The Americans had given up on complex tactics. This was pure shock. Hit them hard enough and even the best infantry would break. 200 yards. The British line remained motionless, a red wall bristling with steel. No square formation, no falling back. Just that impossibly thin line, 2 ranks deep, waiting. Smith felt the first tendrils of doubt. Why weren't they forming square? Had they run out of time? Or did they know something he didn't? 100 yards. The charge reached its crescendo, horses at full gallop, dragoons screaming war cries, sabers gleaming even in the gray light. The sound was immense. Hooves like artillery, leather creaking, metal jingling, men shouting. An avalanche of violence bearing down on 600 men standing in the open. 70 yards. Morrison raised his hand. The entire British line tensed. Connor's musket was aimed at the lead horse, a huge bay that seemed to fill his vision. His finger found the trigger. Sergeant McCarthy's voice, calm as if on a parade ground. "Aim low, boys. Give 'em the horses." 50 yards. The dragoons could see British faces now, see individual soldiers, see the muskets all pointed at them. Some of the horses, smarter than their riders, began to balk. Smith spurred harder, keeping his mount on course. 40 yards. 30. Morrison's hand fell. "Fire!" The volley was different this time. Not one unified crash, but a rolling thunder as companies fired in sequence, left to right along the line, creating a continuous wall of lead. 600 musket balls, 3/4 of an ounce each, moving at 1,000 feet per second. The physics were simple and brutal. Smith's horse went down instantly, front legs shattered. He felt the world tilt and flew through the air, landing hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. Around him, the charge disintegrated into nightmare. Horses screamed, terrible, almost human sounds, as balls punched through their chests and bellies. Animals fell forward at full gallop, crushing riders, creating obstacles that horses behind could not avoid. The pileup happened in seconds. 40 horses down in the first volley created a wall of thrashing, screaming flesh. Dragoons were thrown, trampled, pinned under dying mounts. Those still horsed tried to turn, but momentum carried them into the wreckage. More horses fell, more men died. Wheeler, watching from the shattered remnants of his column, saw the cavalry charge transform from terrible beauty to horror in the space of a heartbeat. The British line remained untouched. They were already reloading, movements precise despite the carnage 30 yards in front of them. Some dragoons on foot tried to rally, swords raised, but they were isolated individuals now, not a coherent force. They stumbled back through the mud, joining the general retreat. Boyd put his telescope down. His hands were shaking. In less than an hour, he had committed 2,500 regulars and 150 cavalry to battle. Both forces were now broken. The woods were still contested. He could hear firing from that direction, and the center was a disaster. American bodies littered the field between his position and the British line. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Muskets, packs, hats, a regimental flag trampled into the mud. The British line stood exactly where it had started. Not a man out of position. Not a hint of wavering. Impossible mathematics. 900 holding against 2,500 plus cavalry. But the mathematics were right there in front of him, written in blood and broken formations. Morrison watched the Americans pull back and knew this was the moment. The enemy was broken physically and psychologically. Their will was shattered. Now came the decision that would either secure victory or throw it away, whether to remain on the defensive or attack. Remaining on defense was safer. The Americans might reorganize, might try again, but Morrison's position was strong. He could wait them out. But waiting gave the enemy time to recover their nerve, to bring up reinforcements, to adjust their tactics. The window for total victory was now, while the Americans were still reeling. "Fix bayonets." The order rippled down the line. 600 men drew their 17-inch triangular bayonets and locked them onto musket muzzles with metallic clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the relative quiet after the volleys. The bayonet transformed the musket from a firearm into a spear, turned infantry into a moving wall of steel points. Major Clifford rode up, surprised. "Sir, We're advancing. The line will move forward. Slow march, maintain formation. When we close to 50 yards, we charge." Clifford's face registered shock, then understanding, then grim determination. Attacking with inferior numbers was madness by conventional logic. But conventional logic had already failed the Americans twice today. Morrison was betting that one more shock, seeing the line they couldn't break now advancing on them, would finish the job. The drums beat a different rhythm. The British line stepped forward as one. 600 men moving in perfect formation, bayonets leveled, flags flying. They advanced at a walk, not a charge. Deliberate, inexorable, each step dressed perfectly to maintain the line. And then the sound began. Deep in the chests of 600 British regulars, building from growl to roar, huzzah! Step, 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 huzzah! Not random shouting, but unified, rhythmic, the ancient battle cry that had echoed across European battlefields for generations. Huzzah! Wheeler heard it and felt something break inside. The force that had destroyed their columns, shattered their cavalry, was coming for them. His brain simply stopped processing tactical options and moved straight to survival. He ran. No shame in it, no conscious decision, just the body's overwhelming need to escape. Around him, what remained of the American force dissolved. Men who had stood under cannon fire and musket volleys for an hour finally reached their limit. Officers screamed orders to stand fast, to reform, to hold ground. The men ran anyway, not all at once but in a cascade. First one, then 10, then everyone. Regimental cohesion evaporated. The army became a mob. Lieutenant Holloway, emerging from the woods where his light infantry had been locked in their own vicious struggle, saw the rout and tried to stem it. He grabbed a fleeing soldier by the coat, spinning him around. "We can rally! Form on me!" The soldier's eyes were wild, unfocused. He shoved Holloway aside and kept running. More men streamed past, some wounded, most just terrified. Holloway looked toward the British line, saw it advancing with parade ground precision, and felt his own resolve crack. The professional part of his mind recognized what was happening. Total psychological collapse. The surviving part of his mind screamed at him to run while he could. He dropped his sword and ran. The British line advanced another 100 yards, then Morrison called the halt. No need to pursue further. The field was won. The Americans were fleeing toward their boats in complete disorder. Chasing scattered individuals would only break his own formation and risk ambush. Better to hold the ground and let the enemy run. Sergeant McCarthy stopped advancing and looked around. The field of Crysler's farm had been transformed. What had been plowed farmland was now churned mud mixed with blood. American bodies lay in lines where the volleys had struck them, clusters where the cavalry had piled up. The smell was already terrible. Blood, gunpowder, voided bowels, and something else, something metallic and organic that all battlefields shared. Private Connor bent over and vomited, left hand pressed against his shoulder where a ball had grazed him, pain he'd ignored during the fight. McCarthy let him, making no comment. The boy had stood through the entire fight without running. He had earned the right to be sick. Around them, other soldiers were sitting down heavily, legs suddenly unable to support them as the tension drained away. Some were laughing with nervous relief. Others were silent, staring at nothing. The Canadian voltigeurs and Mohawk warriors emerged from the woods, their own fight finished. Dubois' gray uniform was spattered with mud and powder residue. His rifle was hot to the touch, fired so many times the barrel needed to cool. He looked at the main battlefield and felt a weary satisfaction. The flank had held. The woods had been a nightmare of close quarters fighting, shot for shot with American light infantry, but they had held. Chief Karanhiakaha led his warriors out, counting heads. He had lost 3 men in the woods fight, good warriors who would be mourned. The Americans had lost many more. Bodies still lay in the ravine, where they had tried to force a crossing. The chief looked at Morrison and nodded once. Professional to professional. No words needed. The job was done. Morrison dismounted and walked the battlefield. This was the commander's burden, to see what victory actually meant. He stepped carefully around bodies, both British and American. 22 of his men were dead, 148 wounded. Nearly 20% casualties. The 49th had been hit hardest, holding the center against the main American assault. He stopped at the cavalry wreckage. Dead horses were still twitching, dying slowly. The smell was overpowering. American dragoons lay crushed beneath their mounts or scattered around them. One young officer was still alive, pinned under a dead horse, eyes pleading. Morrison signaled his men, "Get this man out." Carefully! British soldiers lifted the horse, it took 6 of them, and dragged the American free. His legs were crushed, but he would live. Morrison knelt beside him. Easy, Captain. We'll see to your wounds. Smith looked up at the British officer, trying to process that his enemy was offering help. Morrison's face was not cruel, just tired. The face of a man who had seen too many battlefields, who knew that today's enemy was tomorrow's prisoner and next year's exchanged officer who might be met again in peacetime. My men, many are wounded, some are dead. That's what happens in battle. You fought well. Your charge was executed perfectly. Our defense was simply better prepared. Smith closed his eyes. Perfect execution, perfect defeat. Story of this entire disaster. The American wounded were being gathered at Chrysler's farmhouse, which had been converted into a field hospital. British and American surgeons worked side by side, professional necessity overriding national allegiance. The wounded were triaged with brutal efficiency. Those who would die regardless received laudanum and comfort. Those who might survive with amputation were taken to the operating tables. Those with minor wounds were bandaged and set aside. The operating room was a butcher's shop. Limbs were removed without anesthesia, patients held down by orderlies, while surgeons sawed through bone. The screaming was constant. Outside, piles of amputated arms and legs grew. This was 19th century military medicine, crude, painful, and marginally better than nothing. Wheeler sat against a tree, unhurt physically but unable to stop shaking. He had run, left his musket, his equipment, his messmates, survived by abandoning everything that was supposed to matter. Around him sat other survivors, equally stunned. Some were wounded, makeshift bandages already soaked through with blood. Others were simply exhausted, faces blank with shock. An American sergeant he didn't recognize stumbled over, collapsed next to him. The sergeant's eyes were fixed on some middle distance. I've been in 5 battles, never seen anything like that. They just stood there. We threw everything at them, and they just stood there. Wheeler found his voice. How many did we lose? Don't know. Hundreds. Maybe more. The sergeant laughed, a sound without humor. We had 2,500 men. They had 900. We lost. The words hung in the cold air. They had lost. The impossibility of it was overwhelming. Every calculation, every reassurance from officers, every confident prediction, all proven wrong by 2 hours of controlled British violence. The American army had been smashed not by superior numbers or favorable terrain, but by something more fundamental. Discipline, training, leadership. The intangibles that turn soldiers into veterans and veterans into legends. On the river, the American boats were being loaded with a desperate haste. Wounded were dumped aboard with more speed than care. Equipment was abandoned, no time to gather muskets or packs. The priority was simply to get away from this cursed field before the British decided to advance again. The rumor spreading through the fleeing army was that Morrison's 900 were invincible, that bullets bounced off them, that they would pursue and slaughter anyone who stayed. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than belief. The psychological dimension of warfare was as real as the physical. A defeated army believes itself beaten, and that belief becomes self-fulfilling. The Americans had lost confidence in their ability to defeat this particular British force. No amount of numerical superiority could overcome that loss of faith. Wilkinson received the news in his cabin and felt the world tilt. His aide, pale and shaking, delivered the report in a voice that barely qualified his speech. Sir, General Boyd's compliments. The attack was repulsed. Casualties estimated at 450. The British held their position. The army is falling back to the boats. Wilkinson stared at the maps in front of him. The campaign, his last chance at redemption, was collapsing. He had sent 2,500 regulars to destroy 900 British and Canadian troops. The British had won. How? The mathematics were impossible. Unless the British were simply better. Better trained, better led, better disciplined. Unless American doctrine was flawed, tactics outdated, leadership inadequate. Unless everything Wilkinson had built his career on was wrong. A second aide entered without knocking, which was itself a sign of crisis. General, urgent dispatch from the south. Courier just arrived. Wilkinson took the sealed paper with hands that shook from more than illness. He broke the seal, read, and felt what remained of his hopes crumble to ash. The message was dated November 1st, over a week old. General Wade Hampton reported engaging Canadian militia at Châteauguay on October 26th. The engagement had been repulsed. Hampton was withdrawing to winter quarters at Plattsburgh, deeming further advance impossible. The southern pincer was gone, had been gone for weeks, and no one had told him until now. Wilkinson looked at his maps one final time. 2 arrows pointing at Montreal, representing 11,000 men and America's best chance to win the war. The southern arrow, Hampton's 4,000, had been broken by 300 Canadian militia and voltigeurs. The northern arrow, Wilkinson's 7,000, had just been bloodied by 900 British regulars at Crysler's farm. Both pincers shattered, both by forces a fraction of their size. Both defeated not through overwhelming enemy strength, but through their own inadequacy. The strategic picture crystallized with terrible clarity. Montreal was still defended, now alerted to American intentions. Winter was approaching, would arrive within weeks. The supply lines were overextended. The Army's morale was shattered, and the British had proven they could defeat American forces despite enormous numerical disadvantages. There was only one decision left to make. Wilkinson called for his senior officers. They assembled in his cramped cabin, Boyd still spattered with mud from the battlefield, brigade commanders grim-faced, staff officers avoiding eye contact. The general looked at each of them, seeing in their faces the same knowledge he carried. "Gentlemen, I have received word from General Hampton. His offensive was turned back at Châteauguay on October 26th. He is withdrawing to winter quarters." The silence was absolute. Boyd's face went white, then red. "October 26th? That was 2 weeks ago. We've been continuing this campaign for 2 weeks after Hampton failed?" Wilkinson had no answer that would satisfy. The truth, that he had only just learned of Hampton's defeat himself, sounded like incompetence, which it was. A functioning command structure would have communicated this vital intelligence immediately. Instead, couriers had been delayed, messages lost, and the northern pincer had continued its doomed advance in ignorance of the southern pincer's failure. The strategic situation has changed. Without Hampton's forces, taking Montreal is no longer feasible. Add to that today's setback, and I believe we have no choice but to abandon the offensive. "Setback?" Boyd's voice cracked. "General, we were destroyed. Not defeated in a hard fight. Destroyed. The men are terrified. They think Morrison's troops are invincible. How do we take Montreal when we can't beat 900 men on an open field?" More silence. Everyone in the room knew Boyd was right, but military courtesy demanded they wait for Wilkinson to reach the conclusion himself. "The Army will withdraw to the American side of the river. We will establish winter quarters at French Mills. In spring, we will reassess. There won't be a spring campaign." Boyd was past caring about courtesy now. "Sir, this was our chance. The largest American army of the war, 11,000 men, and we couldn't even reach Montreal. The British will reinforce. The Canadians know we can be beaten. What happens in spring is we negotiate, because we've proven we can't win this war by force." Wilkinson wanted to argue but found no words. Boyd was correct. The War of 1812 had reached its high water mark here, on this November day, on the muddy fields of Crysler's farm. Everything after would be denouement. The orders went out. Withdraw, cross to the American side, establish winter quarters. The great offensive of 1813 was over. The army that had set out to conquer Canada was retreating, beaten by forces that by all logic should not have been able to defeat them. Dawn arrived on November 12th with snow, not the light flurries of the previous day, but steady accumulation, winter announcing its arrival with finality. The American boats drifted downriver through gray water under gray sky, carrying men who had learned the difference between confidence and competence. Wheeler sat hunched against the gunwale, watching snowflakes dissolve on the surface of the St. Lawrence. Behind him, invisible now in the snow, lay Crysler's farm and everything he had believed about himself. The boats were overcrowded with survivors who had abandoned equipment in their haste to escape. Muskets littered the battlefield they had fled, hundreds of Springfield rifles that would be gathered by British soldiers and added to captured stores. The mathematics of defeat extended beyond casualties. Every weapon lost, every cartridge box discarded, every piece of equipment left behind represented future battles compromised before they began. A soldier near Wheeler was weeping quietly, face buried in his hands. Not from physical wounds, he bore none, but from something deeper. The man had been in the front ranks of the column when the British volleys struck. He had watched friends disintegrate, had been sprayed with their blood, had somehow survived when logic said he should not have. Now his mind was processing trauma that would resurface in nightmares for decades. French Mills, their destination, was a miserable collection of half-built barracks on the American side of the river. The army would winter there, 7,000 men crammed into inadequate shelter, waiting for spring campaigns that most now doubted would materialize. Disease would kill more men than the British had, dysentery and pneumonia working through overcrowded quarters with ruthless efficiency, but at least they would be alive. That was the whispered consolation passing among the survivors. We lived, we survived, we will see home again. The dead at Chrysler's farm would not. 450 American casualties, more than half the force Boyd had committed to battle. The British had killed or wounded nearly 20% of the attacking force, while losing less than that percentage of their own total strength. The mathematics were damning. Wilkinson's command boat pushed through the snow with the general still sequestered in his cabin. He had not emerged since receiving the twin catastrophes of Boyd's defeat and Hampton's earlier failure. Aides brought him reports and received orders in return, but Wilkinson himself remained invisible, a ghost haunting his own command. Inside the cabin, surrounded by maps that now mocked him with their optimistic arrows pointing toward Montreal, Wilkinson confronted the wreckage of his career. At 56, this had been his final chance for redemption. A lifetime of scandal and accusation might have been erased by a triumphant conquest of Canada. Instead, he had commanded the largest American army of the war to its most humiliating defeat. Court-martial was inevitable. He would be charged with incompetence, perhaps cowardice for commanding from a sickbed while men died following his orders. His political connections might save him from execution, but not from disgrace. History would remember James Wilkinson as the general who failed at the gates of Montreal, who lost to forces a fraction of his size, who ended American hopes of northern conquest. What history would not know, what Wilkinson prayed would never be discovered, was his service as Agent 13. The Spanish payments had ceased years ago, but documentary evidence existed. If enemies chose to dig deeply enough, if investigations became thorough enough, treason charges might follow incompetence. And treason meant the noose. He tried to compose a dispatch explaining the withdrawal to his superiors in Washington. Words failed. How to describe 900 British regulars stopping 2,500 American regulars without sounding deranged? How to explain cavalry routed in a single volley without admitting tactical blindness? How to justify continuing the campaign for 2 weeks after Hampton's defeat without confessing to failure of intelligence? The dispatch remained unwritten. Outside, snow continued falling. Boyd stood at the rail of his transport, watching the shoreline slide past. His thoughts were clearer than Wilkinson's, but no more comforting. He had executed the battle according to doctrine. Secure flanks, advance in columns, commit reserves when needed. The tactics were sound, proven in European warfare. The American soldiers had been brave, advancing into fire that should have broken lesser troops. Yet they had lost. Not through cowardice or incompetence, but through encountering an enemy better prepared, better trained, better led. Morrison had chosen ground that negated American numerical advantage. British volley fire had been delivered with mechanical precision that turned mathematics into slaughter. And when the moment came, Morrison had possessed the audacity to counterattack, transforming American defeat into rout. Boyd understood military history well enough to know this battle would be studied. West Point would analyze it, debate it, use it to teach future officers about the importance of leadership and training. He would be remembered as the general who commanded at Crysler's farm, his competence overshadowed by catastrophic defeat. Fair or not, that would be his legacy. A younger officer approached, saluting despite the informal circumstances. Lieutenant Holloway, West Point graduate, survivor of the woods fight. His uniform was torn and muddy, face showing exhaustion. "Sir, the men are asking, what happens now?" Boyd considered the question. What happens when an army is defeated not by enemy superiority in numbers, but by superiority in everything that actually matters? We survive winter. We go home. We remember. Remember what, sir? That discipline wins battles. That training matters. That leadership cannot be replaced by numbers. Boyd's voice was harsh. We threw 2,500 regulars at 900 professionals and lost. That shouldn't be possible. But it happened because their soldiers were better drilled, their officers were better prepared, and their general was better at his job than ours. Holloway absorbed this bitter honesty. Will we try again? For Montreal? No. The certainty in Boyd's voice surprised even himself. This was our chance. Largest army we could field, perfect strategic opportunity, and we couldn't even reach the city. The British will reinforce now. The Canadians know we can be beaten. Spring will bring negotiations, not invasions. The lieutenant left Boyd to his thoughts. The general returned to watching snowfall, contemplating a war that had reached its high water mark and was now receding. America would not conquer Canada. The border would remain. Two nations would share the continent, divided by more than geography now, divided by the memory of this failed invasion and the battles that stopped it. At Crysler's farm, Morrison dealt with victory's obligations. The wounded required constant care, morphine supplies running low as surgeons worked through triage queues. British casualties were being evacuated to better facilities at Cornwall and Montreal, transported by wagon over roads rapidly becoming impassable with snow. The American wounded presented a dilemma. Hundreds remained, too injured to travel with the retreating army. Military convention required Morrison to care for them, a burden on his limited medical resources. The British commander accepted it without complaint. These men had fought bravely under poor leadership. They deserved treatment, not abandonment. A makeshift ward had been established in Crysler's farmhouse and surrounding outbuildings. Wounded Americans and British lay side by side, enemies on the battlefield but equals in suffering. Surgeons moved between them without distinction, treating injuries based on severity rather than nationality. Wheeler had been brought here after the retreat, a ball wound in his thigh discovered only after adrenaline faded. The injury was not life-threatening but painful and debilitating. A British surgeon had cleaned it, removed the ball, and dressed it with surprising gentleness. The surgeon, an older man with blood-stained apron and exhausted eyes, worked without speaking beyond necessary medical questions. Wheeler watched him probe the wound and realized something profound. This man viewed him not as enemy, but as patient. The surgeon's oath transcended national allegiance. Later, as infection fever set in, Wheeler drifted in and out of consciousness. In lucid moments, he was aware of British soldiers bringing water, changing bandages, offering what comfort they could. The propaganda he had absorbed before the war, that British soldiers were monsters, tyrants, oppressors, dissolved in the face of this mundane compassion. Sergeant McCarthy stopped by the ward during his rounds, checking on wounded from both sides. He paused at Wheeler's cot, studying the fevered American private. "You'll live, lad. Seen worse wounds heal clean." Wheeler's eyes focused with difficulty. "Why help us? We invaded your country." McCarthy considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You're a soldier who followed orders. Nothing personal in that. War's the business of generals and politicians. We're just the poor bastards who do the actual fighting." He adjusted Wheeler's blanket against the cold. "Besides, tomorrow you might be exchanged. Go home. Never come back to Canada. Or you might heal up and we might face each other in another battle. Either way, treating you decent now is just human." The American private tried to formulate a response, but fever claimed him again. McCarthy moved on, leaving Wheeler with thoughts that would shape his understanding of war for the rest of his life. The enemy was not evil, merely professional. The conflict was not moral crusade, but political dispute, and the soldiers on both sides were more similar than different. Men doing a job, trying to survive, hoping to go home. Smith was in worse condition, ribs broken and lungs compromised from his fall. He lay in delirium, reliving the cavalry charge in fevered dreams. In lucid moments, he spoke to British officers who visited, discussing the battle with the detached professionalism of military men analyzing a chess game. We executed the charge correctly. Formation was good, speed adequate, target selection sound. A British major, there to gather intelligence about American cavalry tactics, nodded agreement. Your dragoons are well trained. The charge would have broken most infantry, but not yours. No, we drill specifically for this. Aim low, volley by ranks, create a wall of fire that stops horses rather than riders. Cavalry cannot charge through dead mounts. The major's tone was educational rather than boastful. Your tactics were correct. Our counterattacks were simply more thoroughly prepared. Smith closed his eyes, processing this. Next time we'll use artillery to suppress your line first. Soften the formation before committing cavalry. And we'll disperse to avoid artillery concentration, then reform for the cavalry defense. War is evolution, Captain. Both sides adapt. The conversation exemplified something larger. Professional soldiers on opposing sides shared more with each other than with the civilians who sent them to war. They spoke a common language of tactics and terrain, understood each other's constraints, respected competence regardless of nationality. The hatred, when it existed, was abstract and political. On the ground, between men who had faced death together, there was only the fellowship of arms. Morrison visited the wounded when time permitted, moving through the wards with quiet efficiency. He stopped at each British casualty, offering words of encouragement and noting names for letters he would write to families. The dead were entitled to official notification, but the wounded deserved personal attention from their commander. Private Connor was recovering from a minor wound, a musket ball that had grazed his shoulder during the battle. Morrison paused at his cot. "How are you feeling, Private?" Connor struggled to attention despite lying down. "Better, sir. Surgeon says I'll heal quick." "Good. The 49th needs all its green tigers." Morrison's voice softened slightly. "You stood well yesterday. Your first major action?" "Yes, sir. I was terrified." "Every sensible man is. Terror is the mind recognizing danger. Courage is acting despite terror." Morrison studied the young soldier. "You'll have other battles, some easier, some harder. Remember what you learned yesterday. Stand with your mates, fire on command, trust your training. Do that and you'll survive." The commander moved on, leaving Connor with pride that almost balanced the horror of what he had witnessed. Almost. The memory of the American columns being shredded by volleys would return in nightmares, would make him flinch at sudden loud noises for months. But Morrison's words that terror was normal and courage was choosing to act anyway provided framework for processing trauma. The British casualties were proportionally severe despite overall victory. 170 men killed or wounded from a force of 900 meant nearly 20% losses. The 49th Regiment had borne the brunt, holding the center against the main American assault. Entire sections had been hit by American artillery, entire ranks disrupted by the scattered fire that American columns managed before British volleys silenced them. Families in England and Ireland would receive letters expressing regret for their loss and pride in their son's or husband's sacrifice. The letters would be carefully written, following templates but personalized enough to show the commander had noticed the individual soldier. Morrison took this duty seriously, often writing late into the night, finding words that might provide comfort to people he would never meet. The American dead presented a different problem. 450 casualties meant over 100 killed outright or dead of wounds. Mass graves were necessary. The ground was too frozen for individual burials, and time was limited. British soldiers and Canadian militia worked together to dig long trenches in soil that resisted every shovel stroke. The bodies were laid in rows, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. British, Canadian, and American dead side by side in the democratic equality of death. A chaplain read service over each grave, words about sacrifice and salvation that seemed inadequate against the reality of young men dead in a foreign field for reasons most could not clearly articulate. Dubois participated in the burials, finding the work strangely cleansing. During battle he had killed at distance, rifle fire that reduced men to targets. Now handling bodies, feeling their weight in cold stiffness, the abstraction dissolved. These were men. Men who had families, hopes, fears. Men whose deaths he had contributed to. Chief Karanhiakeha observed the burials from a distance, thoughts more complex than the chaplain's simple prayers could accommodate. His warriors had killed in the woods fight, close quarters violence that was personal and brutal. The Mohawk did not share European notions of honorable warfare or proper burial. The dead were dead, their spirits gone to wherever spirits went. The important thing was that the Mohawk had survived and the American expansion had been checked, at least temporarily. But the chief was pragmatic enough to understand that this victory was temporary. The Americans would return, if not this year, then next, if not next year, then the decade after. Their hunger for land was insatiable, their population growing, their sense of manifest destiny impervious to military setbacks. Eventually, the sheer weight of numbers would overwhelm any defense. The Mohawk alliance with the British was calculated survival. The British at least acknowledged nominally some indigenous rights. The Americans acknowledged nothing beyond their own expansion. So the Mohawk fought beside the British and would continue fighting as long as the British remained viable allies. But Karanhiakeha harbored no illusions about long-term prospects. His people were fighting for time, not victory. Time to adapt, to negotiate, to find some accommodation with the inevitable future. He watched the bodies being covered with earth and wondered how many more graves would be filled before this larger conflict. The clash between indigenous peoples and European colonizers reached its conclusion. The answer was too many, always too many. Snow continued falling, accumulating on fresh graves, softening the harsh reality of churned earth and disturbed ground. By spring, the graves would settle, grass would grow, and Crysler's farm would return to agriculture. The dead would be forgotten except by families who mourned them and soldiers who had stood beside them. But the battle would not be forgotten. Already it was entering the realm of legend, stories spreading through both armies about the impossible victory and catastrophic defeat. Numbers would be exaggerated, British 900 becoming 600 in some tellings, American 2,500 becoming 4,000 in others. The truth would be buried under layers of mythology. Morrison understood this and found it simultaneously frustrating and inevitable. Military history was written by survivors with agendas, shaped by national pride and institutional needs. His careful after-action reports would be filed and forgotten, while dramatic narratives took hold in popular imagination. The strategic consequences of Crysler's farm extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The American campaign of 1813 was finished, its twin pincers both broken by forces a fraction of their size. Montreal was safe, Upper Canada secure. The British position in North America stabilized. More importantly, the psychological impact reverberated through both armies and the civilian populations behind them. The Americans had learned they could not simply march into Canada and expect victory through numerical superiority. The Canadians, British, French, and Indigenous alike, had learned they could defend their territory against invasion. These lessons would shape the remainder of the war and the peace that followed. In Washington, news of the double defeat would arrive in mid-December. Too late for any military response before winter closed operations entirely. President Madison would face political crisis, war hawks demanding escalation, while peace advocates argued for negotiations. The following year would see continued fighting, including an American tactical victory at Chippewa that partially restored military pride. But never again would the United States attempt the kind of strategic offensive that had failed so completely in 1813. In London, the victory at Crysler's farm would be overshadowed by larger events in Europe, where Napoleon's empire was collapsing after the disaster in Russia. But in Canada, the battle would assume enormous importance, a foundational myth of national survival against overwhelming odds. The irony was that both sides would draw correct lessons from the battle. The Americans would improve training, reform tactics, replace incompetent commanders. The British would recognize that colonial defense required professional troops, not just militia. Both military establishments would become more effective. But the larger strategic situation, that neither side could decisively defeat the other, would remain unchanged. The War of 1812 would end in stalemate, borders unchanged, grievances unresolved. All the blood spilled at Chrysler's farm, and other battles would purchase nothing except the status quo ante bellum. Boyd understood this on some level as his boat continued downriver toward French mills. All the casualties, all the suffering, all the courage displayed and lives lost. For what? To prove that Canada could not be conquered and America could not be subdued? That lesson could have been learned through diplomacy rather than blood. But nations do not learn through diplomacy what they can learn through war. The human cost was irrelevant to the political calculations that started conflicts and the pride that sustained them. Soldiers died so politicians could save face, so nations could maintain their sense of honor, so maps remained unchanged while graveyards filled. These bitter thoughts accompanied Boyd into winter quarters and would color his view of military service for the remainder of his career. He would continue serving, would fight in later campaigns, would eventually retire with honor. But Chrysler's farm would always represent for him the gap between what war promised and what war delivered. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. The wounded at Chrysler's farm either recovered or died, transferred to permanent facilities, or buried in frozen ground. The armies settled into their respective winter quarters, Americans at French mills, British scattered across defensive positions throughout Canada. Wilkinson was court-martialed in the spring of 1814, charged with incompetence and failure of command. His political connections secured acquittal on the most serious charges, but his military career was finished. He would spend the remainder of his life writing self-justifying memoirs that convinced no one and died in Mexico in 1825, broke and disgraced. His service as Agent 13 was not discovered until years after his death, adding a final layer of infamy to an already tarnished legacy. Boyd continued serving and performed competently in subsequent engagements, his reputation partially rehabilitated. But he never again commanded forces on the scale of Chrysler's farm and never forgot the lessons of that November day. Morrison was promoted and honored, becoming a Canadian hero. But his greatest battle had already been fought. He was seriously wounded at Fort Niagara in 1814, an injury that never properly healed. The wound complicated by infection, he died in 1826 at age 47, his health compromised by service. Canada mourned the man who had saved the nation. Wheeler returned to Vermont after being exchanged, his wounded leg healing, but leaving him with a permanent limp. He married, farmed, raised children, and never spoke of Chrysler's farm except once to a grandson in 1849, shortly before his death. The old man, fever-ridden and dying, finally allowed himself to remember. We weren't beaten by soldiers that day. We were beaten by men who had become something more than soldiers. They had discipline so complete it looked like courage. But it was deeper than courage. It was will made manifest in human form. The grandson recorded this in a letter that survived in family archives, one of the few first-hand American accounts that acknowledged British superiority without qualification or excuse. Sergeant McCarthy survived the war and returned to Ireland, where he lived until 1863, long enough to see Canada survive as a separate nation. In his old age, he told stories of Chrysler's farm to grandchildren who listened with wide eyes to tales of impossible victory. The old sergeant always ended with the same observation. We stood. That was all. When every instinct screamed to run, when the odds were impossible, when defeat seemed certain, we stood. And standing was enough. Captain Smith recovered from his injuries and wrote extensively on cavalry tactics, incorporating the bitter lessons of his failed charge. His manual on proper use of mounted troops became standard reading at West Point and influenced American cavalry doctrine for decades. He never blamed his dragoons for the failure, only the circumstances that sent them against prepared infantry. Dubois returned to farming near Montreal, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised a large family. He named his first son Joseph, after Morrison, and his second son Charles, after de Salaberry, who had won at Châteauguay. The rifle that had served him at Chrysler's farm hung over his mantle until his death in 1867, the year of Canadian Confederation. His grandchildren would tell stories of how he had defended Canada against invasion, stories that grew more dramatic with each telling. Chief Caroniacium continued leading his warriors through the remainder of the war, fighting in several more engagements. After peace was declared, he worked to secure Mohawk land rights, with limited success. The British alliance had been pragmatic necessity, but British gratitude proved short-lived once the American threat receded. The chief died in 1829, still fighting, now with words rather than weapons, for his people's survival. Private Connor rose to sergeant and eventually to commissioned rank, his career built on the foundation of competence displayed at Crysler's farm. He never lost the nightmares, the screaming horses, the torn bodies, the smell of blood and gunpowder, but he learned to function despite them. In 1842, he wrote to Morrison's widow expressing gratitude for the colonel's leadership and mentorship, a letter that the widow treasured among her late husband's effects. The battlefield itself underwent transformation. For decades, it remained farmland, plowed and planted in seasonal cycles. Farmers sometimes unearthed bullets, buttons, fragments of equipment. These artifacts were collected, sold, or displayed in local museums. Veterans occasionally visited, growing older and fewer with each passing year, standing in fields trying to explain to younger generations what had happened there. Then in the 1950s came the St. Lawrence Seaway Project, a massive engineering undertaking to deepen the river for modern cargo vessels. The project required flooding vast stretches of land along the river. Crysler's farm fell within the flood zone. Historical societies protested. This was sacred ground, they argued, the site where Canada's survival had been secured. To drown it for commercial shipping was sacrilege. But economic imperatives overrode sentiment. The seaway meant jobs, trade, prosperity. The dead were gone. The living needed commerce. A compromise was reached. Before flooding, archaeological surveys would document the battlefield. Artifacts would be recovered. Monuments would be erected on the new shoreline, above the flood zone. The graves would be relocated to higher ground, the dead given new resting places with appropriate ceremony. In 1958, descendants of soldiers who had fought at Crysler's farm gathered for a final ceremony before the flooding. Old men who remembered hearing stories from grandfathers who had actually fought stood in the fields that would soon be underwater. They collected soil in jars, taking pieces of the battlefield home. The flooding proceeded through the summer and fall. Water rose slowly, inexorably, covering fields where blood had soaked into earth, where columns had shattered and lines had held, where 900 had defeated 2,500 and changed history. Within months, 30 feet of water covered the battlefield. Ships began using the deepened seaway, carrying cargo across geography that had once been a killing ground. But the monument remained, standing on the new shoreline, overlooking water that concealed history. Bronze plaques listed casualties from both sides. British and American names side by side in death, as they had been in the mass graves. The inscription was simple. Here beneath these waters, 900 British, Canadian, and Native warriors turned back an American invasion force of 7,000, defeating 2,500 in direct battle. Their courage saved Canada, November 11, 1813. The date was significant. November 11th would later become Remembrance Day in Canada, originally commemorating the World War I armistice, but resonating backward through time to include all Canadian military service, including the War of 1812 battles that ensured Canada's survival as a separate nation. In the 21st century, the monument still stands. School groups visit, guided by teachers explaining the battle's importance. Historians debate details, question casualty figures, argue about whether Morrison's victory was genius or luck, whether American defeat was inevitable or avoidable. Divers occasionally explore the submerged battlefield, discovering artifacts that museums display under careful lighting. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged. On November 11, 1813, 900 men held against 7,000, not through miracle or magic, but through discipline, training, leadership, and the terrible mathematics of volley fire delivered at optimal range against targets too dense to miss. The battle demonstrated principles that remain valid, that quality can defeat quantity, that training matters more than courage, that ground selection determines outcomes, that leadership is the force multiplier no amount of men or material can replace. These lessons are still taught at military academies, still debated by military historians, still relevant wherever professional soldiers study their craft. The human cost is harder to quantify. 600 men killed or wounded, families destroyed, lives altered, trauma carried silently through decades. Wheeler's limp, Morrison's compromised health, Connor's nightmares, Smith's obsession with proper cavalry doctrine. These were the real casualties of Crysler's farm, the wounds that did not appear in casualty lists but shaped lives nonetheless. And what was purchased with that blood? A border that remained unchanged, a nation that survived to eventually become independent, a war that ended in stalemate with all participants claiming victory. Was it worth it? The question has no objective answer. Ask the families of the dead and receive one answer. Ask the nation that survived and receive another. Ask historians and receive a dozen contradictory analyses. But stand at the monument on the modern shoreline, looking at water that conceals battleground, and the question becomes personal. Here men stood when standing seemed impossible. Here they fought not for abstract principles, but for immediate survival, for their mates, for the regiment, for the thin line that could not be allowed to break. Here courage and terror existed simultaneously, separated only by training and leadership. The river flows on, broader and deeper now, carrying cargo ships that dwarf the boats that brought American soldiers to this bend in 1813. The water is cold and dark, indifferent to the history beneath its surface. But on the shore, the monument endures, bronze weathering but words remaining legible. Names of the dead, date of the battle, simple acknowledgement that here something important happened. School children read the plaques and try to imagine. Most cannot. The gap between modern safety and historical violence is too vast. But some feel it, that connection across time to men who stood in mud and snow, who heard musket balls scream past, who saw friends die and kept fighting because that was their duty. Those children, feeling that connection, carry forward something essential. Not glorification of war. The monument lists casualties too honestly for that. Not nationalism, though the battle clearly shaped Canadian identity. What they carry forward is simpler and more important. Memory. Memory that these men existed, fought, died, mattered. Memory that their choices on one November day rippled forward through time to create the world we inhabit. This is what monuments do. They anchor memory against the current of forgetting. Without the monument, Crysler's farm would be just another stretch of river, the battle just another obscure engagement in a war most people barely remember. With the monument, the dead have names and the battle has meaning, and so the reckoning continues, generation after generation visiting the monument, reading the names, asking questions. What was it like? Why did they fight? What did it mean? The answers change with each generation's perspective, each historian's interpretation, each visitor's understanding. But the questions endure because the monument endures, because memory endures, because we need to remember that our world was shaped by people who made hard choices in impossible circumstances. The St. Lawrence flows past the monument, carrying ships toward destinations that would have seemed fantastical to the soldiers of 1813. The water is 30 feet deep over the battlefield, cold enough to preserve artifacts that rest on the bottom. Occasionally divers retrieve them, a musket ball, a button, a bayonet, tangible connections to that November day when discipline defeated numbers and 900 became legend. But the deepest artifacts are not physical. They are the lessons that endure, the principles demonstrated, the truth that Morrison and his 900 taught at such cost. That standing when others flee, that holding when others break, that maintaining discipline when chaos beckons. These are the qualities that decide battles, win wars, and shape nations. The thin red line held at Crysler's farm not through supernatural advantage, but through mundane excellence repeated 600 times over. Each soldier doing his duty, firing on command, holding position, trusting his mates. Multiplied by discipline and leadership, this became something greater than arithmetic could predict. The American soldiers who broke were not cowards. They were men who had reached their limit against an enemy better prepared for this specific fight. Their courage in charging into musket fire was real. Their terror in fleeing bayonets was justified. But courage without competence, bravery without discipline, numbers without leadership, these proved insufficient against professionals who knew their craft. Both sides learned. The Americans improved training, reformed tactics, developed professional military education. that would eventually produce armies capable of meeting British regulars on equal terms. The British recognized that colonial defense required investment in professional troops and infrastructure. The Canadians discovered a nascent national identity built on successful resistance to invasion. These lessons, purchased with blood at Chrysler's farm, rippled forward, shaping military doctrine, national myths, historical understanding. The battle became textbook example of quality over quantity, proper defensive tactics, and importance of terrain selection. Generals studied it, soldiers remembered it, nations mythologized it. But beneath the tactics and strategy, beneath the national narratives and military analysis, remained the human reality. Men fought, men died, men were wounded in body and spirit, men ran or stood based on factors they barely understood themselves. Men became heroes or cowards in moments, their fates determined by circumstance as much as character. The monument acknowledges this with its simple listing of names. Not heroes and cowards separated, not British glory and American shame divided, but names, men who fought on November 11th, 1813, at a place called Chrysler's Farm. Some lived, some died, all mattered. The monument says, remember them. Not the mythology, not the simplified narrative, but the men. And so we remember, or try to. The battlefield is gone, drowned and silent under 30 feet of cold water. The men are gone, dead for 2 centuries, their voices stilled, their stories filtered through time and interpretation. But the monument remains, bronze and stone resisting erosion, words carved deep enough to survive weathering. On November 11th each year, as Canada pauses for Remembrance Day, some gather at the monument. Wreaths are laid, names are read, silence is observed. The connection is made across time, from modern peace to historical violence, from our world shaped by their choices to their world that no longer exists except in memory. The St. Lawrence flows past, broader now, deeper, its waters indifferent to human meaning. But on the shore, the monument endures. Here 900 stood, here 7,000 came against them. Here the line held and a nation was saved. Here ordinary men did extraordinary things, not through superhuman virtue, but through training, discipline, and leadership that transformed individual courage into collective strength. The lesson transcends the specific battle. It speaks to every generation that faces overwhelming odds, that must stand when standing seems impossible, that must hold when breaking seems inevitable. The thin red line at Chrysler's Farm demonstrated that such stands are possible, not through magic or miracle, but through preparation meeting moment, through discipline overcoming fear, through leadership making possible what individuals alone could never achieve. This is the reckoning, that the battle mattered, that the men mattered, that their choices shaped futures they would never see. This is why the monument stands, why the memory endures, why each generation must learn again what those 900 taught at such cost, that standing is sometimes all that matters, and standing together, properly led and thoroughly trained, even the impossible becomes achievable.